This console release has been very, very interesting because I think it marks the beginning of a general shift when it comes to how Nintendo consoles are viewed online. One that I haven't really seen a lot of people bring up or talk about because, people really forget what it was like 10 years ago, where it really felt like in the general online gaming community, the only platforms on the market were the PS360. Okay. Like only PlayStation and Xbox. Nobody talked about the Wii. Nobody addressed it. Nobody brought it up at all. Like the narrative at the time was that Nintendo was like this lesser brand that appealed to casuals, that wasn't a big deal, that the real games were exclusively on Xbox and PlayStation. This was before even like the PC Master Race thing, right? People really, really forget what that period was like. And it kind of dawned on me, looking at like the discussion of the Switch 2 online, how things have changed. Because back then, everyone would just ignore the Nintendo console. Everybody ignored the Wii U, everyone ignored the 3DS. Everybody ignored all the great games that came out on those platforms. And so many of these people were so adamantly against the Switch day one. Angry Joe, for example, has only ever reviewed two Nintendo Switch games: The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild and Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3. That just goes to show you just how little this guy covers Nintendo consoles, even though the Switch was like this major phenomenon. You can see that like all these people did everything in their power to bend over backwards to downplay Nintendo Switch and to downplay the games and to say that nothing was coming out and to like say the console would soon be replaced in like 2018. Like there was this big push to push this idea. And now, like with the Switch 2 era, they tried the same tactic. They tried coming out and saying that like the Nintendo sucks, I don't like them, they don't have any games I'm interested in. And the thing that's changed is that like, well, first of all, people are calling them out on it because it's so obviously untrue. But like the second half of this, the thing that I think is way more like interesting is that like the gaming personalities have to at least acknowledge Nintendo exists. Because like we're at the point now where you cannot just write off Nintendo and like pretend that they're going to go bankrupt in like a year or whatever, because like they're too big for that. They've expanded too much. They've been too successful. They're not going anywhere. Like the people who are like hating on Nintendo now have been doing it for over 10, 15 years. And longer than that, I think. You come to think of it. Like longer than that, they've been like going all along this song and dance, and it used to work. People used to like eat this stuff up like hook, line, and sinker. This idea that like Nintendo was some like awful, terrible like brand and company. And we're at the point now where that's just not being accepted in general. More and more people are like beginning to notice that like Mario Kart World is a phenomenal game. The Legend of Zelda is a phenomenal series. We're getting to the point where people are beginning to acknowledge that Pokemon is a phenomenal series. After decades of being trained to think that like these games fell off a long time ago, like people are beginning to wake up and like kind of notice things, notice things about like the general group of people who are like pushing these lines of thought. I keep bringing up like Angry Joe as like the go-to example of this. How he claims that like the reason he can't like cover Nintendo content is because they copyright strike his videos. Never mind that he has like the round table discussion format where he doesn't have to use gameplay footage, right? Never mind that. Like what he's describing is simply not true. Because if what he was saying was true, other YouTubers would be having the same issue, and that simply just doesn't happen. People like Arlo can just upload Nintendo content with like no repercussions whatsoever. Like Joe is straight up lying to people when he says that like Nintendo is copyright striking his content. Like it's just not happening. So with that being said, like the real reason he doesn't want to cover Nintendo consoles is because like he desperately wants like people to be steered more towards like the brands that he's partnered with, that he has affiliations with, that he has like ties to. He doesn't really want like Nintendo to exist because like he doesn't really directly benefit from them. He'd much rather like, do his man-child thing and hype up Marvel and Superman and stuff like that. Like like it's so amazing, seeing people like, seeing this guy, like hype up a new Superman movie while simultaneously trying to call Nintendo childish. It's embarrassing, but that's kind of my point. Looking at this culture of people who just hate Nintendo, it just doesn't make sense in 2025. Like nothing they say holds any water whatsoever, and everything they come out with is just a complete and total cope. And what's more is, like, more and more people are starting to see through it and calling it out for what it is. Every time these guys like react to a Nintendo Direct and have to sit there and pretend that they wouldn't be interested in a single one of these games that come out, and demonstrate that they don't know anything about the characters of the franchises, like it just kills their credibility more and more, because like all of the directs over the past couple of years have been extremely well received, and these guys just can't bring themselves to face it and like acknowledge it at all. It's just, but more and more like liking this stuff is becoming mainstream. Like their way of thinking is outdated. It really is stuck in the early 2000s, and they just haven't grown and evolved with the times. Like they refuse to do it, and more and more we are seeing more and more pushback to their behaviors and their attitudes. Like more and more people are noticing that these YouTubers and these shills are doing everything in their power to kind of downplay every major Nintendo game that comes out. It's embarrassing, and much like the whole like Steam Deck thing, where I was talking about how obnoxious the fanboys were like 3 years ago, like it feels like we're on the verge of like this thing becoming mainstream, because these guys insisted that like the Switch 2 was overpriced, the games were too expensive, that no one would want to buy it, and they have already been completely disproven by the sales numbers. Like you saw like people like Daily Destin, going out like Walmart, like, oh, my store is packed with Switch 2s, no one's buying them. Like, and meanwhile, you can go out today and look today and see that they're sold out. It was always just a gigantic cope, and what's happening now is that like they can't bring themselves to admit it. The giant cope among these people is that like, well, Nintendo fans will eat up anything. Like they don't care how badly they get screwed over, but like they don't really think to themselves like why people are Nintendo fans. They don't realize just like people love their games. Actually, that's one of my favorite lines from these people, from like the Raging Golden Eagles of the world. Like, oh man, people only love Nintendo because they produce good games. Like, what else do you want them to do? It's, to me, like that's very telling as to like what these people, the priority of these people actually are, because it's not about playing good games, it's not about enjoying yourself, it's not about discovering something new, fresh, or exciting. It's entirely about like being part of this like weird, toxic online community. And you can see this in all ways, shapes, and forms when it comes to like the anti-Nintendo demographic. But like, I hope in the next like 3 years, people learn to stop taking these people seriously.